Okay, let's set the scene. Imagine it's April 2026. The US is bogged down in a conflict with Iran. And according to a pretty fascinating, though fictional analysis from former diplomat Maleeha Lodhi, there's just no good way out. Her whole argument is that the United States has basically trapped itself in a war it can't win, but also can't leave. So let's dig into how that happened.
So what does a no-win war even look like? It's a great question, right? And it's not just about the number of casualties or how much money is being spent. According to this analysis, it's a strategic trap. It's when a superpower finds itself completely stuck in a mess of its own making, with only two ways forward, and both of them lead to disaster.
And this is the fundamental bind. On the one hand, you could just cut your losses and get out now. But, the author argues, with Iran looking like it has the upper hand, that would be seen as a humiliating defeat on the world stage. So the other option? Well, you just keep fighting, sinking deeper and deeper into a costly, endless quagmire with absolutely no victory in sight.
And you can really see this strategic confusion in President Trump's conflicting messages. One minute, he's threatening to blast Iran back to the Stone Age, and then the next, he's saying talks are ongoing. The author uses this kind of whiplash to show just how much of a mess the U.S. strategy really was.
So the big question is, how did the U.S. get trapped like this? Well, the author says it wasn't just bad luck. Not at all. It was the direct result of a series of really fundamental miscalculations that were made long before the first shot was ever fired.
The analysis boils it down to 4 critical assumptions that turned out to be disastrously wrong. First, the U.S. believed Iran would fold in just a few days. It didn't. Second, they assumed that taking out key Iranian leaders would create chaos. Nope. Third, they figured there was no way Iran could stand up to the combined might of the U.S. and Israel. Well, it did. And finally, maybe the most fatal assumption of all, that Iran would never ever dare to retaliate against America's allies in the Gulf. It absolutely did.
And another huge blunder? Underestimating simple geography. Apparently, the U.S. National Security Team never really planned for Iran seizing control of the Strait of Hormuz. By controlling that one critical choke point, Iran suddenly had its hand on the tap of the global economy, and that gave it a ton of leverage.
So, caught in this mess with pressure mounting, the article suggests the U.S. was thinking about its next move. And it was a move that could have been the biggest blunder of them all, a massive ground offensive.
The potential target for this big escalation was Karg Island. Now, this is Iran's main oil export terminal, so going after it would be a huge gamble. The idea was to strike a decisive blow by hitting a super high-value target, which also made it an extremely high-risk target.
And a quote from President Trump really captures the, let's call it the casual but serious nature of this whole idea. He admitted that if the U.S. went in, they would be there for a while, which is a pretty clear sign that nobody thought this would be a quick, clean operation.
And Iran's response to all this chatter? According to the source, it was completely unambiguous. Iranian officials basically came out and said their forces were ready, that they were waiting for American soldiers, and that they would rain fire on any invading troops. They were promising a fierce and bloody fight.
Of course, a conflict like this doesn't just happen in a vacuum. A key part of the author's analysis is all about the huge and really damaging ripple effect this war created all around the world.
The international fallout was severe. I mean, first, you had global economic turmoil. Energy prices were spiraling, threatening a worldwide recession. But almost as damaging was the massive diplomatic rift it created with key allies, not to mention the long-term damage it did to security across the whole region.
And you really couldn't ask for a clearer snapshot of that diplomatic rift than this quote, which the article attributes to French President Emmanuel Macron. It's such a sharp public critique of the U.S. approach. It perfectly captures that deep frustration among America's traditional allies in Europe.
And that frustration, it wasn't just words. The analysis shows how European allies actually backed it up with action. They denied the use of their airspace for U.S. military flights. They refused access to U.S. bases on their soil. And they flat out rejected any calls to help in the war effort.
And all of this leads to what the author argues is the single biggest fallout from the war. It's not a military defeat, but something even worse, a profound and lasting crisis of credibility for the United States on the world stage.
I mean, think about it. For decades, Gulf nations relied on the American security umbrella. But when Iran was able to actually strike targets on their soil, even with a huge U.S. presence nearby, that promise was broken. The analysis shows how this just starkly and very publicly exposed the limits of American protection.
And that brings us to the author's central takeaway from this whole affair.
It's a powerful summary of the main lesson here. Military might is not enough. It produces hubris, but not the outcome sought. Over-relying on force, she argues, leads to the exact miscalculations that create these no-win situations in the first place.
So that leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question. If overwhelming military force can fail this spectacularly, then what truly defines a nation's power and influence in the modern world? That is definitely something to think about.